These are the Victrix Games German Panzer IVs, World War II model tanks. They're plastic kits, and I'm going to build and paint this set. There's 6 tanks, 2 per connected sprue here per pack. 1/144th scale is also very close to N scale, which is a railway model scale, which you can actually get lots of buildings for these tanks in that scale that might be suitable for terrain. Victrix provides you with this instruction set with paint details inside. I sort of loosely followed this, but I used my own paint colours and just my own experience to paint them rather than follow this exactly. First thing I did here was provide myself a new scalpel, just a nice clean one that's ready to go, and nothing better than starting with a sharp knife when you're going to be cleaning up plastic kits. Quick close-up here of the sprue. You can see there's very few parts, mostly just the hull, the turrets, side tracks, and a few other bits that go on in terms of the exhaust there as well. Very clean. I'm using these Tamiya Clippers. I've had these for a few years. Well worth the investment in a good sharp set of clippers. And then I just whiz around these, clipping everything off the 6 different sprues. I'm just demonstrating here that I put the flat edge against the parts just to remove as much of the sprue clipping as possible from the actual kit that's coming out there. And it reduces any extra tidy up that you're going to do with a scalpel afterwards. With these being relatively small, simple kits, being in 12mm, there's not a lot to them. Detail's fantastic, as you can see there on that whole portion. They've certainly not held back on adding detail, and there's enough parts to give it enough detail at this scale of 12mm. And this is where I'm using the sharp scalpel and just trimming off any last bits of flash and sprue from the clippings I've done on there. Again, at this scale, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these in terms of making the plastic absolutely smooth and perfect, because they're for wargaming, so I'm not focusing on the sort of showcase. It's really a case of just getting them done, cleaning them up enough to be able to use them on the tabletop. Yeah, so it's just a simple case of quickly trimming off any leftover sprue parts before I sand down any larger chunks, like these sections on the top of the tracks that were sort of slightly larger and needed a little bit of sanding down. So once this trimming has been done, I'm now using some of this sanding paper that comes in a pack and a small piece of acrylic that goes with it. These have been very handy because they're just about the right size for these small scale jobs that I'm doing. Again, for speed, I'm not using different sized grit or anything here. I've just got a 400 grit that'll do the job on these. I won't need to go any finer. You just stick this onto the piece of acrylic provided, and it's a nice sturdy base to be able to sand these tanks with. Just going light on here, don't want to push too hard or I'll start to take the design out or wipe out some of the plastic, because it's very soft really when you're using a bit of sandpaper on there. Don't need to be too harsh on the edge. But I do go around every one of these pieces like that, just along the top to clean it up. And then clean along the edges like that as well to make sure it's ready for priming. There's actually very little tidy up. You can see I clipped that during the clipping off of the sprue, and then I'm just giving it a very slight sand. It looks like it's abraded it a little bit, but you can't see that when the primer's on really at this scale. And again, not looking for perfection, just looking to get them done quick. So just whizzing around the whole set like this and cleaning off any areas that look like they need a bit of a sanding. I use the Tamiya Extra Thin Cement because it's very fine and runs into all the small nooks and crannies on these vehicles as you glue them together. You get a sort of capillary action that sucks it into the joints if you put it along the edges. And it's just easier to use than the thicker stuff, especially when you've not got any supporting structure. It's not like these are a big piece of terrain vehicle or something with something suspended like an arm or something on them. Because they're so small and simple, the glue doesn't have to work very hard, so just a few drops in there and then it clips together. Once that's together, I just have a look where the seam is there and I run another bit of glue, just putting a drop along the edge, and that sort of sucks it into the connecting areas, giving a slightly stronger bond. You can see it sort of rips down there using the capillary action. Whoops, going on. Oh, a little bit too generous on the glue. Easily done. Just I'm now putting the engine deck onto the top of this hull, and it just slips on the back nicely. It's got some extra details on there, and then the exhaust, and I'm not sure what the rest of the stuff on the back is, sort of gearing and suspension and exhaust that goes on there, and just closes off the back neatly as well. Those exhausts I do in a kind of a rusty colour as well, so they're a nice standout item in terms of detail on the figure. And a very minor issue here where the peg towards the front of the track, it was a little bit large, and I required a little bit of fettling to dig out the hole, the corresponding hole in the track section. And it just meant that everything fitted together a bit more smoothly, and there was no issues with those armour panel sections being connected up against the hull. I did squeeze them on firmly here just to make sure that everything was tightly fitting, and then actually when I had the other side of the tracks on as well, I firmly squeezed them together a second time, plus added a couple of drops of glue against those sections that lined up against the hull at the top there. Just a blob of glue added in here before the hatches popped on. No fussing about here with adding the gun to the turret or anything, it's just nice and simple in one piece. So that was my model complete. I just put this one of the 6, I put the sort of tank commander in the top. You could do that with more than one in your set, but I just thought it made it distinctive. I'm probably going to do more than the 6 that I did originally as well, so I may end up with another with the hatch open on the top too. But for this set I did 5 with the hatch closed and 1 with the commander model that comes in the set on top. For priming and the rest of the painting I used these short steel rulers, which are available cheap on big online stores, and then I put washers underneath and a few magnets that I just plop onto the steel rulers. And it means they're just on there for the life of the paint job really, that I can easily move them around, getting to different areas on the tanks, and because I'm doing them as a kind of factory line, it was nice and easy. These pipettes are about 2p, 3p each if you buy them in bulk on something like eBay, and I just cut the ends off them and stuck the peg straight in there. No glue required, it just pushes into the top of that pipette. With those popsicle turrets on the pipettes, I'm picking up my surface primer. I'm using German dark yellow, which is Dunkelgelb, and all I'm going to do is add a bit of airbrush flow improver, probably about 3 or 4 drops into the top of the airbrush. I use an Iwata airbrush, And this stage is really quick and easy because there's no detailing. I'm just going over quite strongly with the primer from Vallejo, just making sure I get every side done. This is essentially a shortcut because I'm using the primer as the base, and Vallejo conveniently give you the Dunkelgelb colour in a primer. It means I'm stepping out and using one stage primer and base coat. And because these aren't being used for sort of showcase vehicles, this isn't 1/35th scale perfection I'm looking for. So just going on with the old Dunkelgelb, and that's going to be my base coat as well as primer. Although you do need to leave it for 12 hours to cure, because this stuff I find for some reason just doesn't fix well on plastics or metal if left for just a few hours. It needs at least an overnight to properly cure off. So my principle is to do smaller vehicles that I paint lighter. So I'm using surface primer again, mixed with some sand to lighten up the top areas of these tanks. Now the guide for these Panzer IVs that comes with the models in the pack from Victrix actually shows very detailed masking off and then shading and highlighting on different panels on the actual tank itself. I'm doing a very shortcut version of that, mixing in my sand with the Dunkelgelb and then just going over the larger panel tops and sides just to give them a highlight. I'm not doing that sort of ultra scientific approach of edging up to the different panels and just sort of going on with a general highlight all over. On this side armour plates, I'm again just trimming along the top. You can see it's just highlighting the very top edge. Just noticing here the airbrush actually is getting a bit clogged up, so I use a brush with some water on the end just to go over the needle, and that just cleans off any paint that are clogged up on there. It's a very gentle way of cleaning an airbrush mid-spray. So these are the popsicles, again just going over the top of these with one highlight. It's a lot harder to try and edge just along the trim of those armoured panels, so basically with these I'm mostly just aiming down from above, and you can see it's getting lighter there as I spray down. This last step is just the sand neat, just mixing it in with some of the airbrush flow improver as well. Using a brush to do that, just mixing it in the actual reservoir on there, so you can see now I drop a few drops of the flow improver in there too, that keeps it running through the airbrush smoothly without drying too much. Because this is a real super highlight now with the sand colour, I am just making sure going just along the edges. Again, I'm not paneling different sections, just generally just trimming along there. You can see from the back, just making sure it's touching the back sides of those sort of mud flaps on there and the engine deck. And then again on the front, just going along the edge to give it a highlight. There's no gradient or any clever work going on here. It's just, I'm making sure it's just touching the edges as I spray. And again, just these are going rather light now, almost like a desert camo. Despite me wanting to go for that sort of classic Dunkelgelb and dark green and brown, I'm highlighting them up quite heavily. But then again, that's because these are small and I need them to look a little bit brighter on the table, and because the various layers of shades of weathering that go on will also dull them down as well. Again on the top here, just trying to trim the edges. It's very hard to do actually, but you can see along the top of the turret it quickly lit the top of the main gun turret there. I'm using Liquitex soft body acrylic. It's very thick, so it needs mixing with its medium to get it through an airbrush, but they are designed to work through airbrushes, and they do go a long way. For the actual camo itself, I'm just doing stripes basically. In some places I put kind of blobs on the top and the side, but mostly I went for stripes. Again, because they're so small, it's quite hard to do this in anything other than just a straight line. And I was getting my eye back in here because my airbrush has been a bit neglected over the last couple of years. Well, actually almost a year, I think, till I've used it properly. So you can see some areas I've gone a bit heavy on as well, but all of these can be fixed in the various washes and weathering stages later on, really. I'm using a very light shade of green, and I'll mention that again right at the end of this video. I'll just talk about looking back over the paint job to confirm whether all my decisions on the colours, etc. were correct. So I start out by doing the hull without the turrets on, but later on I pop the turrets off the pipettes that I was spraying them on, and they will go back on the pipettes for some work later on, but I then popped the turrets on top and then continued some of the camo over the top as well. Sometimes lining it up, sometimes it's not lined up with the hull camo, but it's just went for that sort of random approach again to get quite a lot of the green on there and try and make it seem as randomly camo as I could do. For the brown, I'm now using that raw umber colour. Both the raw umber and the green oxide colour there, when mixed with the medium, do go a little bit transparent, so that does help you actually, because the transparency when mixed with a mixing medium means you've got some sort of forgiveness in terms of it's not going to totally blast on that colour and blot out everything that was underneath there before. You can see a bit of a failure on the left there where a very large big brown spot got dumped on there by me, and that was just a case of going on too heavy with the airbrush on the left. If I go on too heavy, I tend to just blend it in a bit more to make it look a little less striking. Plus also I went over with the Dunkelgelb and sand mix again, just on some of the edges to take off some of the harsher bits of paint that have gone on too heavily, which was, it's a tricky thing to do on vehicles of this size. So here they are, all camoed up, bright and shiny really, waiting for decals or decals, however you prefer to pronounce it. I'm going to use the ones that came in the pack, very conveniently provided by Victrix. Some of the iron crosses in there, along with some numbering as well, which I'm going to put a distinct number on each one of the vehicles on both sides of the turret, and the iron cross will go on the hull as well. These are water slides, so all I do is just use a ruler to cut them up and then drop them into some water before using a brush to apply them to the side of the vehicles. So once cut into very small sizes, they're dropped in the water and left for a minute or two as they soften and come off the paper backing. Then use a long brush like this to apply them sort of very moist so that I can still move them around. As you can see, they sort of jump about, float a little, dry the brush off momentarily and then push them around again to get them into position, which doesn't take too long to do. Some extra care taken on one of the longer numbers here, just requires a little bit more patience to drop it on and then use the moist brush to float it around on the surface before it gets into position, which can be a little bit tricky on these very small spaces. I always use this microsol on decals just because it's nice and easy. It softens the decal onto the side of the vehicle and makes them go almost flat as if they're painted on. You do need to do about 3 or 4 coats, so depending on your patience level, as it dries, you add a little bit more on there. It's just sort of splash it on and eventually the decal will almost disappear as if it's just been painted on. I did it about 3 times on these and that gave them a nice flat finish really. I'm combining the chipping with highlights. I'm using the Liquitex soft body parchment colour for the initial highlight chip, and then neutral grey 5 they call it from Liquitex, mixed with a bit of their ivory black for the darker bits of the chip. So this edge highlight goes on with the parchment colour from Liquitex, and I'm using quite a heavily laden brush. A long thin brush though, just means it can go for quite a long time, and you can see where I'm just picking out edges and panels where there might be some wear and tear. The key for me when I'm doing this is I don't want to do every single edge and every single panel. It'll just be sort of randomly picking them as I work around. They're going to double as a chip because in some instances I'm going to use the dark grey mixed with the black to fill in some of these, like a little dark chip on the surface as well. But again, I won't fill every one of these, I'll just pick some as I work around for a general effect of chips, in addition to these being a potential highlight at the same time. So either angle the vehicle away from you or towards you to add these small edge highlights / chips. The long brush with quite a lot of paint loaded on there means that I can spend quite a lot of time applying it across the whole vehicle without having to jump back to get extra paint on the brush. So now I'm going on with this darker grey, just mixing it with a bit of black and some of the Liquitex mixing medium there. That's that white looking stuff on the right. By mixing them together, I get a kind of medium grey, which I can use to add the chips. I don't add the chipping darker colour to every single one of the highlights. It's just a few where I just dot on the odd dark patch to show that some paint's flecked off and there's some metalwork being shown up underneath. Not every one of the white or parchment coloured chipped edges that I've added are going to get the black grey added to them. It's just a few, and as you can see I dot along some of them, which kind of just adds that chipping detail without making it overbearingly weathered to pieces. I'm not taking an awful lot of care here, trying to do this as quickly as possible, so whizzing rounds, trying to get them ready for the table rather than focusing on absolute pristine perfection in terms of these chips. Where I have got a larger splat of the parchment colour, I will infill it with some of the dark grey, as you can see here on the side, just leaving some of the parchment visible along the edge. So just assessing here the chipping and weathering edges that I've done in the highlights, and I'm quite happy that's probably enough on there. Don't want to go on too heavily with them. At the same time, they're offering me just enough of a highlight. I can see they're picking out the detail. Again, with something so small as these in 12mm 1/44 scale, I don't want to go too heavy on the highlights, but at the same time I want enough on there to be able to pick out the details from tabletop, bearing in mind we're looking very close here. Mahogany stain is a favourite colour of mine from Lifecolor, and I'm using it to paint the exhausts, which are going to be rusted on the back. It's quite thin down again, but I go over them twice. You can see it's not fully covering it with the one coat, so I do go back over again with a second coat of this, and then the coverage is pretty good and done. Rust. This is another colour from Lifecolor, and it goes on as a sort of quick highlight onto those exhaust sections on the back. As with other techniques here, it's doubling as a highlight plus making it look a little bit more rusty, so that gives me a sort of combination effect in one go. So with the chipping done, with some of the details done on the side of the vehicles as well, I'm moving on to the filter and wash in one here, which is this burnt brown, which goes on very heavy, as you can see, using a big brush and splashing it literally over everything. It's one of my favourite colours from Lifecolor because it's so forgiving as well. It's not like a heavy stain like any of these sort of modern washes, which I use in a minute as well to darken some of the panel areas, but this goes over like a filter and is extremely subtle. In fact, you can add a couple of layers to it as well, and I'm really impressed always with the result, even in small scale models like this. It does take a little while to dry, so I give them sort of 10-15 minutes after I've splashed this all over. Really, it goes on everything. To further darken some of the panel lines, I'm mixing up a brew of Reichland Flesh Shade with matte medium and some water added in there as well. So you can see the blob of the white mixing matte medium with the flesh shade, and it goes this more milky colour, although that medium will dry clear. I also add a bit of water in there as well to thin it overall. Unlike the burnt brown that I applied all over the vehicles, this is just going to go into certain key panels, just as I work around the edge of some of the larger areas like the engine deck there, to really highlight and make some of the panel lines pop a bit more. I also go along the panel lines on the edge of the armour too. I'm taking a bit more care here to make sure that I pick key areas and gives the vehicle a bit more definition, but I don't want to splash this over all of the panels. I just want to go around the edges. I'm not looking for perfection with this, so I'm just sort of speeding around the panel edges where I want to see them done. I might also see an area that looks a little bit too bright in terms of the green and just add a bit more on there to dull it down a bit and darken the green somewhat with the brown. What I find if I see this kind of level of dark brown over the entire tank is it can look a bit like a candy apple, where everything has been darkened to a sort of brownish, apple-ish candy colour. So I'm trying to avoid that as well by not placing it over every single area of colour, but using it on the panel lines. But don't hold back. I mean, do splash this over quite heavily after just saying go sparingly. But yes, it's quite an easy way to work again because I've thinned it down. If you use just the neat Reichland flesh here without thinning it with the some kind of mixing medium, either the Citadel's own or the Liquitex one like I used, and some water, if you used it neat, it would probably be a little bit heavy, and you'd have to be more careful because it would be less forgiving on you, because as soon as you splashed a bit on, it will be very dark. You could use a Nuln Oil for this dark wash that I want around areas like the engine deck and the tracks, but again, I've used a Lifecolor one here, which I'm familiar with. I've used it for years, and it's just very forgiving. But if I used Nuln Oil, I'd do the same as I did with the last Citadel one and mix it heavily with some mixing medium and water first to thin it down. It just makes it a little bit more forgiving. Now, there's a point about these wheels here. Each one of those tiny wheels has a rubber track around the edge. And I noticed in the Victrix guide that they provide with it, they actually did appear to paint every single wheel's edge in black. And I just simply wasn't going to do that. I don't think they're visible from the tabletop because these aren't being done for showcase. I'm just going to be looking down on these more than from the side. And to have to paint every single one of those, that's a lot of tyres to add the black onto. So that's why here, this is the first time I've approached the tracks since I've started, and I've just gone on with a black wash into there. Okay, it's not going to give me a perfect black rubbery tyre around every wheel, but it's, again, good enough for me to darken the whole lot down. So up on the top deck, on these engine deck areas, I'm just using some of that smoke again. Really here it's a combination, isn't it? It's looking a bit like smoke, plus it's also looking like some grease and oil that may have been spread around there from maintenance or just general wear and tear as well. And occasionally, there you go, I'm dropping down onto the exhaust as well. I do come back on to the back here with a smaller brush, because it's quite a large brush again, just an old one really, to splash the wash in. But just to make sure I've gone up into the tight edges of some of the tracks there with that dark smoke as well. And I come back with a smaller brush and just add a bit more to darken them down. another stage of doing some of the tracks is just to use some pigment. I've had this MIG stuff for years and don't often use it, but I saw in the guide that came with these Victrix models that they suggested using some pigment on the tracks, so I've done the same. I've got some of that dark earth, mixing it with the mixing medium, which means it binds onto the model, and I'm just going all over the track areas with it with a larger brush. I'm using a large brush because I don't mind this doubling as a bit of weathering as well. Okay, so it's meant to look like rust, mud, and some splashed up mud on the wheels as well, so the whole lot just sort of goes on quite sparingly. But again, with keeping in mind that this area of the model is not going to be seen very much on the tabletop, and of course I'm likely to base these as well at some point in the future. So I could use a smaller brush to make this easier for myself, but I'm using a large brush, and like I said, the pigment then can sometimes occasionally make some happy accidents as it splashes on the wheels or on the mudguard bits or the side of the panels of the hull of the tank itself. I let these dry, and then I just grab my silver pencil, or a graphite pencil would also be fine for this. And then I'm just touching along the edges of the tracks to give them a bit of silvering. It was in the guide again, and I've had a silver pencil like this sitting around, so I thought I'd use it because Victrix had it in their painting guide, so it seemed to be a reasonable thing to do. I'm not sure it's going to show that much unless you look up closely against the vehicle. So from tabletop, if you're trying to get this just into a game, it's probably not really worth doing. But for me, I just whizzed around and touched along the back of it with that pencil. I also touched along the back of the exhaust and some of that kind of running gear at the back too. So I'm not really sure whether that's going to make a difference, but it's a little bit extra bit of a highlight on something, and since I had the pencil in my hand, I used it. So this is the AK Interactive Streaking Dirt, which is another one of these weathering pencils that they do. I've done a couple of videos on these in the past, and they're nice and easy to use. You can either use it in a little bowl of water and thin it down and then apply it, or you can just draw it on, and after you've sort of firmly drawn it on, you can then use water to thin it. And I think it's a kind of a waxy, water-soluble type of pigment that's in there. Again, it's like everything I try and do here, it's a forgiving technique. You could use the oils to do streaking and extra levels of shading on the side, but for me, I use something a little bit more forgiving, which is these pencils, and then use just a water wet brush to move around that pigment and then break it down. It's it's not an accurate science, but as you can see, it's breaking up that pigment and adding another sort of filter of weathering and mud on the side there for me. This is the last step. There's nothing I do after this. I will dull coat them with a matte varnish spray, and I'm looking to base them, but I would do that, cover that in another video. So that's the final stage, is that water-based pencil. So a final look back. I really like the scale 12mm. They've crammed in the detail in these Victrix kits to really provide a nice, sensible level of detail and quick builds without having to sort of pile on lots of extra detail. I would like to add some stowage and other details, which I'll probably do on some future models. And I think they've painted up fine for me. I went for a lighter scheme than I should do because they're a little bit bright on the green side, but now the weathering's on, it's toned them down quite a lot. But in hindsight, I think I probably would use a different green on my next outing to do the next set of Dunkelgelb based German tanks for World War II. So I will probably go a darker green next time, although I'm happy with the result on these. I recently bought the O Group rules for World War II, which are battalion level rules, which will allow you to field a mix of armour and vehicles and artillery as well on the table. So I think this ground scale that these are going to give me, for being 12mm, is going to be great for that game. Plus I also have Blitzkrieg Commander So thanks for making it all the way through the video to the end. Please do add some comments and feedback if you think you've done them differently or used a different green or a different approach to chipping, etc. I'd be really keen to hear. So please comment and hopefully see you around again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.